think of myself as a web developer, a web designer and developer, although I put the designer in there almost aspirationally. I really want to be better at design. I end up doing it and I love it. But maybe not my strength. I think of myself more in that front end developer role where I guess my primary skills lie in the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript of the job of being a web designer and developer. Although I just love pushing those boundaries, I've been
Yeah.
the last year or so, I've been more of a back end developer and trying to push that. And I like it all, but it all centers around websites generally. I know very little about, what it takes to make I don't know, a Swift app for, Apple Store or something like that. I've never done it, never once. And
Mm.
there's a lot to love about the web. So what I do is build websites and help other people get better at building websites generally.
How do you personally go about explaining the importance of online accessibility to someone who'd never considered it before?
I do feel like there's a conflation in front end development a lot with the idea that online accessibility equals screen readers. There's like
Mhm.
a huge focus on like that's important. And I mean, it is, but I don't know to what degree or whatever. And that if you get that particular experience perfectly, it doesn't mean that you've made an absolutely perfectly accessible website, because there's other problems we know too. For example, color contrast is a big deal in accessibility, and has literally nothing to do with the screen reader. So that's two forks right there. But you can't just think of like, oh, there's that fork and that fork. There's this just giant spectrum of human beings that use the internet, and they're all different people, and they all
Mm.
have their own things to think about. It doesn't mean that this is an impossible task. It just means that accessibility it just means helping people the best as you can use your website, who are probably different than you are. An example gets brought up once in a while that I like is that somebody who's like temporarily broken their arms. I broke my arms a couple of years ago. Yeah, like what?
Yeah.
So they're not permanently without arms, but like you could treat them as if they were, in a way. Like what does that mean for using a website? How does that influence how you navigate a website? Should they be not allowed to use their website because their arms are broken?
Mhm.
No, right? Unless you're a real sadist, I'd say that they should probably be allowed to use your website still. They still have a wallet for your e-commerce website or
Yeah.
whatever. That's an example of online accessibility. What's happening in their lives right now? Are they
That's
using your website because they're panicked somehow? Because they need to do something really quickly. That's kind of a version of accessibility, at least
yeah.
in my mind. So it's thinking about the people who use your site and what condition they might be in.
How do you think the web or the internet, let's say the web will change over the next 10 years? So it's a big question. But how do you think the web will change over the next 10 years? And what specific features or habits that exist now do you hope will be seen as from their time? Maybe
Ooh,
in terms of their impact on a more accessible web.
yeah, I mean, you really gotta be a futurist to guess these days. Almost like 1 year is hard to guess
Yeah.
these days. Only because 'cause you're like, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, nobody had any idea what machine learning and AI stuff would. They're just like, "Yeah, that sounds like some cool future stuff."
I know.
And here we are now where it's just blowing up
Yeah.
and doing stuff too. It's not just like, "Hey, look at this cool tech demo." It's like, everywhere you turn, there's I don't know, a stock photo site that's selling you generated images, and there's teachers, putting out curriculum around using AI writing tools to help teach creative writing. And so it's like actually influencing what people are doing. And that just appeared. 10 years is
Mm.
just at that edge where I'm like, I bet the web is going to be super duper different in 10 years, like super duper duper different.
Yeah.
I don't know, the obvious ones that are looming over the industry now are what if I strap a thing on my face and I experience the world digitally through something on my face rather than staring at a screen? If that gets great, maybe we just don't have monitors anymore. Maybe we're not sitting at desks with monitors. We're more just looking at stuff that's just being imposed over our vision.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe, 10 years is a long time. I say it's obvious because it's like, well, Meta's invested in the metaverse or whatever that is. And,
Yeah,
Apple's threatening to put something out. And it just seems like it's an obvious choice because there's already tech press about it. What's more likely to me is that something that you or I just couldn't even
that's it.
imagine.
If you're with someone who needs to check how accessible their website is,
Mm.
in 5 minutes, how would you go about showing them?
There's maybe a couple things. There's the classic like turn JavaScript off and see what's going on the website, because you could do that. There's a checkbox in DevTools and you could pop that open, flip a switch, and reload the page and see how it goes. And that's sometimes a controversial one, but the reason is that like sometimes assets don't load, sometimes fonts don't load, sometimes images don't load, sometimes CSS and JavaScript don't load. JavaScript has a bad habit of being the one that doesn't load because it's often kind of large on websites, and it has some fragility to it that like, ooh, the CDN could be weird, the host could be blocked, there could be a missing semicolon. There's just more things that can go wrong with JavaScript.
Mhm.
And if that can happen to people, not for those reasons, and also reasons like their train went under a tunnel and all that type of stuff, or they're at somewhere with pretty unreliable internet anyway, so the JavaScript is the last thing to arrive and didn't quite arrive all the way. If your website totally doesn't work in that way, then that's a problem. So you could show them that. While you're in DevTools, you could turn off the CSS too, see what kind of structure is looking at there. While you're in there, you could crank the speed down of your website or really slow. Like, what does 2G feel like? That's an accessibility concern. If your website is so big that it basically never loads on those slow speeds, that's kind of a problem. Now, those are like, simulations of problems that could happen with a website.
Yeah.
There's also like, if you're talking to, say, a junior front end developer who's in boot camp or something, those things are still useful, but you could also go a little techier with them, and you could be like, oh, check this out. This company DQ makes a free DevTools plugin called Axe. You could
Yeah.
install that in your DevTools. You can click a button and you can get essentially a report of accessibility problems. You could get that done in 5 minutes. It's that
Yeah.
fast.
In terms of the adoption of more accessible digital products, what do you think is the biggest challenge?
There may be some disconnect from the person and team responsible for building it and the people that might have a problem using it, is I would think the biggest challenge, is that
Yeah.
it's not malice, it's more ignorance. And that's weird. And even if that team is super empathetic and has time on their hands to fix these problems, what are the problems? They don't even know. How do you even know?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so disconnect with the teams and the teams building and designing and leading the building of these products, and the people that are actually using them.
It's optimistic, but I'd like to think that there's a lot of developers that if they knew that the thing they built caused lots of problems for somebody, they'd be like, oh crap, let me fix that. They would, or at least they'd want to and fight for it. And it's more of a problem of just having no idea.
So perhaps with that in mind, I mean, what's one thing that anybody can do or learn to play a part in the progression towards a more accessible web?
If you're a designer and you're hired to and enjoy this part of your life is just like working in Figma all day, that what you can do is actively learn. If you weren't taught and you now have become aware that accessibility is not only a thing but a problem in digital products, that educating yourself is a great start. Just being aware of the potential problems is probably a good thing to do. Where I sit in this like world of front end development and tooling and all that stuff, it makes me want to call out something specific and say that there's things that, only just because I think people benefit from like actionable things.
Okay.
There's so much tooling. There's like, I use this bundler, I use Prettier to prettify my code, I use ESLint to lint my JavaScript, I use Vite because I think it's a cool bundler, I use Netlify because I like to host it there. You have this bag of tricks and,
Yeah.
all about all kinds of that stuff. You probably have this pipeline that gets your code from where you're writing it to production. There's stuff, and it's probably in your head somewhere because your side projects have it too. It's rarely these days like I'm editing a file and sending the exact copy of that file over FTP to a server or something. There's just stuff that happens along the way.
Yeah.
And a lot of times that's referred to these days as like CI or continuous integration or something. Like I'm going to push code, stuff's going to happen to that code, and then it's going to eventually make its way to being deployed.
Yeah.
One of those things can be check this stuff for accessibility problems. And so few people do that. So what's one thing you can do if you're in position, if you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
Make it part of your CI to say there's a problem with this code, and I'm letting you know. Automate it.